It's the same sort of thing, they will say, that happened with St. Francis of Assisi or Xavier or others who claimed no miracles for themselves, but 10 years later there was one or two, and then 20 years later there were 4 or 5, and 50 years later there were 20 or 30 miracles ascribed to them. And that's the way it was, you see, with Jesus. It just sort of all gradually developed like that. It's a cunningly devised fable. Well, what say the facts? I hate to explode fables with facts, but I feel that I must. The facts are that when we go to the sources, we find that in the Gospel of Mark, which was the earliest of the Gospels, and relatively a short Gospel, in fact, the shortest of the 4 Gospels, we find that in the Gospel of Mark there are 20 miracles listed, right from the very first account that we have of his life. The next 2 Gospels are Matthew and Luke, which are considerably longer and considerably later. Therefore, we would assume that there would be a considerably larger number of miracles. The facts are that Matthew has 22 and Luke has 21. That brings us to the Gospel of John, written in about 96 A.D., much later, and also a longer Gospel. And here in the Gospel of John, we should expect by this time to see at least 60 or 80 or 100 miracles. The fact is, we find 8. So, the facts show that just exactly the opposite of the developmental theory of myths was actually what took place. There are pseudo-gospels and pseudo-epigrapha that present such things as the infancy gospels of Christ, where they have him doing all sorts of miraculous things, such as making a clay bird and causing it to fly, or turning one of his playmates into a goat, or having the trees bow down and worship him. These things were steadfastly and continuously repudiated and rejected by the church as never being a part of Christian theology or Christian worship. No, the facts are that the developmental theory of myth will not hold up. As Peter said, we have not made known unto you cunningly devised fables.
Try as they might, the skeptics fail every time they try to discredit historical Christianity. We will return with more from Dr. Kennedy on this subject in just a moment. First, though, what was the first Christmas really like for Mary and Joseph? What perils would they have encountered on their long journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem simply to accommodate the Roman emperor's demand for an accurate census? And is the story as presented in the Gospel of Luke historically reliable? The answers can be found in our latest resource, The First Christmas. This beautiful hardcover book with full-color pictures of modern-day Palestine can be yours for a gift of $15 or more. Our phone number is 1-800-229-WORD, and you can also request it online at truthsthattransform.org. The First Christmas by Dr. Paul Meyer also makes an ideal Christmas gift, and when you order online, your order will be expedited. That's truthsthattransform.org. I'll repeat this information again later. First, though, let's return for more from Dr. Kennedy.
And then there is another effort that is often heard, which says this: well, you know, the Bible was written in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, and it's been translated into Syriac and into Latin and into Armenian and into French and into German and into a dozen other languages, and finally it's come into English, and from there, from one English translation to another. By the time it gets to us, we really don't have the faintest idea of what it said. Now, I suppose that there are very few people here who have not heard that objection raised by some skeptic in their lifetime, and I see many heads nodding right now. The one thing that you always want to remember about the person that raises that objection is this: he doesn't have the faintest idea of what he's talking about. And really, anybody who doesn't know any more about a subject than he evidently does ought to have the courtesy of remaining silent, because the facts are quite the opposite of that. The Scriptures were written in Hebrew and Greek, and all translations of the Scriptures go back to the original languages. Hebrew and Greek are still read by millions of people and all biblical scholars, and therefore when we want to translate the Scripture, we translate from the Hebrew and from the Greek, and we do not translate from a Syriac translation or an Armenian or a Greek or a French or German or Latin or some other kind of translation of a translation of a translation. It's just absolutely not true at all. And the idea that the Bible is like something that was passed on from one person to another person to another person to another person, it goes all the way around the room and you really don't have any idea what the first person actually said, that's not the game. You see, the game is that we give a printed copy of something to the first person in the row, and he tells the person behind him what it said, and that person comes and looks and reads the copy, and then he tells the person behind him, and she comes up and reads the copy and tells the person behind her, and she comes up and reads the copy, and so it goes that there's always a return to the original text, and not dealing with translations of translations. Well, so much for the Christian Scriptures. But some will say that's the only source that you have. Jesus Christ is not mentioned outside of the Bible, the New Testament, or the Old Testament, and therefore we don't have any other sources about him. As usual, people make statements before they examine the evidence. Let me call your attention to the most famous of the Jewish historians, Josephus, whose name is practically legend all over the world. His Antiquities of the Jews is the standard history of the Jewish people over a period of many centuries. He lived in the second half of the first century. He was a contemporary with Peter and Paul and John, and he wrote the history of his own people. He was also a general. In fact, he was a renegade general that was captured by the Romans and went over to their side and was royally and regally treated by them. In his Antiquity of the Jews, this most famous historian of the Jews of the first century, in Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, makes this famous statement, quote, "About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if it be proper to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, o Christos hutas ein. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the instigation of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared unto them again alive on the third day. The divine prophets having foretold these and many other things concerning him, and the sect of the Christians, so named after him, are not extinct to this day." Now, this is a passage which was virtually unanimously accepted down through many centuries until recent times, when it was rejected by radical unbelievers of different types. And they said this is obviously an interpolation. Well, is it obviously an interpolation? Note the facts.